Our next speaker is Mark Musser, and he wrote a book called Nazi Oaks. And it's amazing the information that he came up with in here. He went to what college?
The Evergreen State College.
Evergreen State College in the state of Washington, which he didn't know it when he went there, that it was, kind of the center of environmentalism. And so he ended up with a background in that. Then he went to Western Conservative Baptist Seminary and was a missionary over in Eastern Europe for 7, 8, 9, 10 years, something like that.
7 years.
7 years, thank you. And he started researching this, and it's going to blow your mind, where he demonstrates, among other things, that Baalism in the Old Testament is very similar to modern environmentalism. Surprise. And the role that the Nazis played and all of this kind of stuff, and the same kind of stuff is coming to good old America, as LBJ used to say. Wasn't it America? Something like that. So he's going to talk about Baalism, eco-fascism, and the apocalypse. Wow. Okay.
Thank you very much. Syncretism means mixture, and one of the things that we seem to forget, I'm not sure why this is, it's something overlooked, and that is the mixture of nature worship as a part of the apocalyptic endgame, which the Antichrist will play a part in. Nature worship is predicted. We know from the Old Testament prophecies. We know that even the book of Revelation has something of this as well, discussing these very issues. And so I think it's something we need to look into. And so I've done that, and it's one area that's overlooked. I'm not quite sure why, but environmentalism, the green stuff, or the nature worship seems to be like an undercurrent. It's like an undertow. The state of Washington, we got powerful undertows that you really don't want to go surfing on the ocean beach there. Undertow will take you out to sea very quickly, and in certain cases. And you don't see it, but it's there. And I think the same is true with regard to environmentalism. There's a lot of things going on with the environmental movement that we tend to overlook, not to deny the other things. They're certainly a big part of it as well. Of course, Paul last night talked about Marxism. That's a very important aspect of this as well. But environmentalism is another area, and fascism plays its role, and I think it's going to play a big role in the end times. So I've titled my subject this morning, Baalism, Eco-Fascism, and the Apocalypse. And you will notice when I talk about eco-fascism, I do mean eco-fascism as a historical term, not as a metaphor. A lot of people use it as a metaphor. We're talking about something which is also true, something which the Nazis were involved in, and we'll take a look at that. So we look at our pictures here, and I want you to notice here the oak trees. There's a big oak right there. Baalism, by the way, they did practice a lot of nature worship under the oak trees in the Old Testament. Isaiah 57 in particular will tell you all about it. So will Hosea chapter 4. Other passages in Ezekiel chapter 6 will discuss the issues of oak trees in connection to nature worship and also human sacrifice. So this was a topic it's been around a long time. And oak trees were very important to pass on to the pagans, even after the Baalistic times of the Old Testament. And the Fuhrer was also, he loved oak trees too. And we'll take a look at this a little bit. This will become more evident. Notice here we got an oak tree at Buchenwald. Now, Buchenwald was not a death camp, but it was a concentration camp. And this is a very important oak. We'll take a look at that. And notice here the entrance to Auschwitz. We got an oak tree sitting there. And these were symbolic, and they're actually, I think, indicative of what the Nazis were doing, a big human sacrifice with regard to what they wanted to do for the future. And one of the ways you do that is get rid of the Jew. And the Christians would come after the war, after they won the war. So really, you look at a lot of things that are happening during that time, and we'll take even a look today. Psalm 2, why did the heathen rage? Well, that's a good question. David didn't really have the answer. He wasn't quite sure. We look at that psalm where they're raging about different things. They're all concerned about different things. In fact, they're worried about a lot of things, especially our elites. We get all scared about the elites, what they're going to do, and all their plans they have for us. But a lot of their plans are based on the fact that they're worried. They're scared. And in their unbelief, they're going to foist upon their worries and concerns upon us, where we have to be worried about them too. That's the problem. Now I have to live according to what they're worried about. I'm not sure I want to do that, but that's what they want. And they're worried about a lot of things. They don't believe in God anymore, so Does nature provide? Well, they're kind of concerned about that. They think there's too many people. Well, how are you going to solve that problem? I don't know. I think some environmentalists have some answers to those kinds of questions, and some of our elites do. Can they carry them out? Well, I guess we're going to find out sooner or later. And so these are things which we see in history today. We see them in the past. We saw them in the Old Testament too. By the way, they sacrificed kids for the sake of natural fertility. This occurred during the Baalistic years, during the divided kingdom stage. And by the way, Baalism preceded Israel's captivity in both cases, whether it's the north or the south. Baalism was very strong in both in the northern kingdom and also in Judah before they went to their respective captivities. In fact, I will argue that Baalism is the reason why they went into captivity. And of course, Tim set me up pretty good, because where'd they go? They went into Babylon, which is the center of nature worship. And then from there, God is going to reveal to Daniel the future and the things that are going to take place in the future from the abyss, from the nature worship hellhole of Babylon. God has an answer to all of these things. If we look at Psalm 2 summary, interesting enough, verses 1 through 3, David describes the conspiratory rebellion of the United Nations Security Council against God and his Christ. That's the first 3 verses. That's what they're doing. They're planning to overthrow God's restrictions which he has placed upon them. In fact, that's what verses 1 through 3 really emphasize. What does Paul tell us in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2? Paul tells us that God is restraining men at this point. And that restraint is still happening. He doesn't let people do whatever they want to. I mean, he does give them freedom, but he doesn't let them, there are certain restraints which he has put in place. By the way, one of those restraints is the Tower of Babel and what happened dispersion. He divided out the different nations into different territories and different places, and that places restrictions on people. They want to bring back the Tower of Babel. That's going to be difficult. And by the way, if you look at during the Great Tribulation, it's not going to be easy for the Antichrist to bring about this one world global order either. There's a lot of warfare going on, in case you haven't noticed, in the book of Revelation. And I don't think he's going to do it, because he'll get them close, but it's going to be very difficult. There's going to be a lot of warfare. A lot of people are not going to go along. So there's a lot of things that are going to take place in the future. And the Gentiles are raging even today. And Psalm 2 tells us about this conspiratory rebellion. They want to bring back the Tower of Babel. They want to throw off the restrictions of God. And ultimately, of course, we know God will have the last laugh. And that's also in starting verse 4. David describes God's sovereign transcendent control over the rebellious affairs of the world. And then verses 7 through 9, David reveals a divine counsel within the Godhead that will bring an apocalyptic end to this worldwide rebellion. We know this to be the Great Tribulation. And that's what the Great Tribulation is all about, to bring an end to this conspiracy against God and against his Christ. And then verses 10 through 12, David warns world leaders to humbly trust in the Lord. That's a great psalm. And by the way, many prophecies are very similar to this throughout the Old Testament. It's not something unique to Psalm 2. It's predicated and predicted throughout the Old Testament. And if we were to look at Psalm 2, we would recognize that premillennialism makes perfect sense with regard to Psalm chapter 2. Before the kingdom comes, as prophesied by David and by many other prophets of the Old Testament, especially the later Old Testament prophets make it much more clear, there's going to be a terrible time of human judgment, God's judgment against sinful man, his rebellion. And premillennialism makes perfect sense according to the Old Testament. Now, we have different views today. Of course, postmillennialism, we have that. They believe that Christians will eventually usher in the kingdom of God on the earth. How do they understand this today with all the things we got going on today? I don't quite understand this. They don't understand the opposition which many people have against God and against his plans. They overlook these things. It's too promising. We do have a promise for the future, but there's very difficult times first. The Lord's going to have to clean up the planet, first of all. There's too much sin going on. So that has to be dealt with first, and then we can set up the kingdom. And that's, of course, Psalm 2 and also many other places in the Old Testament. Something else to consider here, this man right here, Mr. Karl Marx. A lot of leftist people, they laugh at our premillennial views about history and about the end times. However, Marxism is actually a millennial view of history. So they laugh at the religious millennialism that we all believe in. At the same time, they've adopted something which is even far more fanciful. It's called the political millennialism. They're going to bring utopia on the earth. And this is going to occur through politics. Now you tell me, which one do you want? Which one is more likely? Political millennialism or the Word of God triumphing over lost human souls? Which one is it going to be? I think God's plan is going to win. And of course, this is all predicated in the Old Testament, predicted by prophets like Isaiah. Notice this linear concept of time. This is very important to the whole modern mindset. The modern mindset has adopted this view of history, and they've applied it to political affairs. They've gutted the supernatural elements of this, but now they've applied this to everyday life, to political affairs. So they look forward to the future, just like Isaiah looked forward to the future. The kingdom is coming, but now this is going to be merely a political kingdom. So don't get discouraged by the fact these guys make fun of us. Okay, we can make fun of them too, because they have borrowed a Judeo-Christian view of history, and they've tried to apply this to politics, and that's never going to work. In fact, it shows God is showing them to be fools. In his own timetable, he will certainly make these things known and be more evident. Today, of course, it's hard to see. If you look at the Judeo-Christian historical consciousness versus the Greco-Roman worldview, the Greeks, they looked at history like a circle. We weren't going anywhere. There was no hope. You had nothing to look forward to. There was no plan in history. It was not linear in terms of what you would look forward to. I mean, it just wasn't existent. So life was a circle. Of course, their whole point was to get out of the circle. How would you do this? Well, through mysticism, through philosophy. If you're more rational, you want to be a philosopher. You escape the doldrums of history, the problems of history, the suffering of history through philosophy. If you're more mystical or religious, you're going to do it through various forms of dreaming and all kinds of other things which they emphasize in that Greco-Roman world. So Christianity comes along and changes that. Now we have a past, we have a beginning, and of course we're leading toward a future, and there's a hopeful orientation toward the future. And modern man has imbibed, and he's actually borrowed this view of history. He's not going back to this view of history. Now, Nietzsche, by the way, tried. I don't think he's quite worked. People haven't followed yet. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And this is a very important fellow, too. His name is Mr. Hegel. And if you look at, he's the man that actually set this up to where now everything, the Judeo-Christian worldview, the historical consciousness is now going to be emphasized through politics. He's going to take away the supernatural elements and apply this to human affairs. And he's going to place Germany on top of the totem pole rather than God's plan, the kingdom which is coming, which is interesting to me as well. So we start out from, notice his idea of progress within history, very similar to, Isaiah looking forward to the future. Well, Hegel looks back and says, look at where we've come from. Wow, look what man has done. And by the way, the deification of man is very important in his thinking. He believed in a form of pantheism, and man, of course, is the apex of history, and so therefore pantheism and human worship are basically the same thing. You can't deny that human beings are the greatest thing that's on the earth. So various forms of pantheism has to be human worship in some way. And Hegel, of course, emphasized this, and he was a big philosopher. So he talks about how we start out Oriental despotism in the old days, and then we have the Greco-Roman world where some men are free, and then finally, we have the Christian Germanic world where all men are free. By the way, I really enjoyed Paul's discussion yesterday. I don't know why we don't call this stuff Christian fascism. Isn't that what it is? What do we got here? Christian Germany, they talked about an Aryan Jesus, didn't they? Isn't that what they, some of these people? Not all of them, but some did. I think Ernst Haeckel, he was a big guy on Darwinism. He looked for an Aryan Jesus. Now they're talking about, a sort of de-Judified Jesus. This kind of stuff goes on. Hegel sort of did it too. So we start out with Persia, tyranny, Greece, democracy. Oh, that's a wonderful thing. Rome, unity and law. Christianity gave us world religion. The Reformation gave us a conscience. And the Enlightenment, notice here, the rational state. Oh, wow. Good government for you. It all makes perfect sense, and everything the politicians do is perfectly rational. That's their view of history. Where do they get that from? From the Bible. And of course, here we have Marxism. They want to create a utopia on the earth where you don't have to work anymore. That was the original Marxian attempt. That's what he wanted, what he tried to emphasize. Industry is going to become so great that you won't have to work anymore. That's classic Marxism. Now, Marxists don't believe this anymore. They believe other things. They're Marxist sort of, kind of, but now what they emphasize is sort of a postmodernism, whatever that is. And really, postmodernism is actually a form of fascism rather than Marxism. They've drifted over into fascist understanding to a lot of things, especially with regard to environmentalism and nature. A lot of Marxists have become environmentalists. And once you transfer from Marxism, that classical view, industry is going to come save us, to nature worship, what happens? You've just changed the game, and now it's fascism. By the way, many Germans did the same thing in the early 1900s. They switched from Marxism to fascism. Mussolini is another example. Maybe no one believes this Marxist eschaton anymore. They've changed their views. Now it's nature worships, environmentalism, postmodernism, and that's what we have today. And of course, in order to get there, a lot of people are going to have to die along the way, aren't they? What are you going to do about all these people that die? How are they going to have a hopeful eschaton in the future? We enjoy no work, and the work. We don't have to work anymore. Mankind is so great. The industry has done so great. We provide so many goodies. People don't have to work anymore. That's what he taught. Well, what about some guy who lived back here? How about the guy who lived here? Or maybe the guy that died of a heart attack right before it all took place? Or how about the whole shooting match here? Is there any hope in this view of history? No. See, this is a Christian view of history, and this requires a resurrection to make any sense. And that's precisely why Christianity has a linear concept of time and a goal orientation to history, because they believe in the resurrection of the dead. And when you don't believe this view of history makes no sense. And so now we have something called Social Security in our own country. And what do? They give you your retirement just as your body falls apart. Wonderful. Okay, what does God do? He provides you with a retirement plan, and then he gives you a resurrection body so you can enjoy it. So which one do you want? Which plan do you want? Can we vote on it? Yeah. Well, what about the 1,000-year Reich? Isn't that millennial as well? Isn't that what they called it? Yeah, I think so. No, actually, it's a little bit different. Probably the 1,000-year Reich is based on Nietzsche. I don't want to get into that whole discussion right now, but that's for some future discussion. Nonetheless, this is a counterculture millennialism. It's against the Judeo-Christian worldview. And Nazism, really, if you look at it, I'm stunned. Nazism is very complicated. We have a caricature of Nazism which is completely false, which the Marxists and the socialists have foisted upon us. It is a very deep movement, and there was a lot of elements involved. Look at this list here. You got Romanticism. That's an early form of what we call today environmentalism. We have social Darwinian evolutionary biology. Boy, that's a loaded term there, too. Social Darwinism, that means Germany's on top, the Aryans are on top. We have Darwinian theory, evolution. By the way, racism used to be big evolutionary science in the old days up until World War II. Then they had a big repentance about the subject. Now they don't even talk about it. They thought the white man was on top of the totem pole, especially in Germany, thanks to Hegel and some other people. And, of course, they're the smartest bunch that ever lived, right? Especially in the 1800s. They had some of the greatest intellects of all time. And what do? They attack the Bible. And then what do? They set up their own German millennialism in its place. Isn't that something? So a lot of different things. Hegelian pantheism was a part of it, a little bit. Nietzschean existentialism. Nietzsche was one of the first existentialists, not the only one, where he emphasized existence, the earth and its existence, against transcendental Judeo-Christian values. God's above nature. So he's going to put everybody within the purview of nature because God is dead. So now he's going to emphasize existence against Judeo-Christian values. Don't pay attention to him anymore. God's dead. They're not going to help you. Nietzsche was revered by many Nazis. And then, of course, we also have heavy doses of paganism and German socialism as well. Of course, they went against the German Marxists, but they still called themselves National Socialists. Hitler believed in a social Darwinian eugenics that would cleanse the blood and soil of Germany from international Jewry and Christian weakness. So this all goes back to, Nietzsche hated the Christian weakness. And, of course, they looked at the Jews as an international, they were destroying the fabric of Germany. They were the Aryans. And this internationalism was destroying and corrupting their country. They wanted to get rid of it. Hitler believed the influence of Christianity made Judaism an international disease that had to be eradicated because it broke the laws of nature. That's what they thought. See, fascism is based on nature. It's different than Marxism is based on humanism. They're different forms of socialism. See, Marxism is based on class warfare, okay? Nazism or fascism is based on laws of nature. Race and nature, basically, is what fascism was. Of course, not all fascists were racist. Mussolini wasn't necessarily. Interesting, the Nazis believed Germany was the promised land upon which to build an evolutionary eugenic world of natural strength according to the laws of nature. By the way, if you're to really look at what Nazism is in its essence, it's basically an ancient fertility cult brought up to date. That's what eugenics program is really all about, dressed up in modern science. Hitler called fascism a spontaneous return to the traditions of Rome. Now, this is very interesting. Fascism may have been the first step to help bring back what we call the Greco-Roman Empire. The geopolitical fallout of the end of the Cold War, the nuclear Cold War helped to foster the cancerous growth of environmental fascism. Everybody's environmentalists today because we're worried about what mankind could do to the earth, and this really began with the dropping of the bomb. This was especially felt in Germany, even though they didn't get the bomb, yet they were bombed into oblivion, and so the Greens in Germany became very apocalyptic in their mentality. And the idea of an environmental apocalypse really goes back to Germany. We'll take a look at this. European multiculturalism has now imported Islamic fascism into its political makeup. Anti-Semitism, therefore, is still going on. Now, how is it that we can have Nazi racism, which was anti-Semitic, and then transfer to multiculturalism and still be anti-Semitic? I don't get it. Can someone explain this to me? It looks like it's pretty much the same thing. And by the way, Hitler was very pro-Islam. He liked some of these people. In fact, he thought these people were going to worship him. He said they're mingling their prayers with my name in it. And he wanted to fall upon their harems, he said, in one particular night dream he had, I guess. I don't know. But he said, I can't eat their mutton because I'm a vegetarian. And, of course, the United Nations has relativized the dangers of despotic governments throughout the world. I mean, most of the United Nations is made up of despots. And, of course, so these concerns are relativized. And this is the world we live in today. What we have today, instead of what we call classic Marxism, we have what I would call millenarianism, which is sort of a political term for millennialism. It's like a post-millennial politics, political situation. A lot of people are looking forward to the future. So we have, the audacity of hope. Yes, we can change. We can believe in. This is all evolutionary time, but it's also language dressed up in religious language. Because evolution basically is a religion. It goes back to the Tower of Babel. It's been around a long time. The Greeks and Romans believed this stuff back, 2,000 years ago. Lucretius, of course, he was a rationalist. This is not something new. Something very old. We can call it millenarianism at the UN. Notice, again, the utopian views they have. The Millennium Development Goals. This is our future. We are to look forward to this future. These are the things that they're focusing upon. In reality, this is what we got instead. By the way, Hitler wanted to cover the Ukraine with windmills. All the sustainable development stuff essentially was born in Nazi Germany. Because what you have is environmentalism, or the early German Greens, coming together with racism, and they merged to create what? Sustainable development. And now this stuff is everywhere, being propagated and promoted every time we read the newspaper. By the way, Charles Manson, he was caught, in the California desert. You know what he was doing? He was in a dune. He stole a dune buggy. And he was pretending to be Rommel out there in the desert, out in the desert sand, and they caught him. Interesting. Of course, we have the New Age movement. Existentialism, again, uses existence itself to trump transcendental Judeo-Christian values. That's what existentialism is really all about. Existence trumps those spiritual realities which we hold to be very dear. Other problem, technocracy is coming out with new forms of digitized biochemical eugenics that makes Nazism look extremely primitive. This is another area, which is a huge area that a lot of scientists are looking into, is something to keep your eye on. They want to provide eternal life for you by putting your mind into a computer onto the web or something. I haven't quite figured this out. Something like this. I've had guys talk to me about these different issues. I'm not an expert on it. I just hear about it and I report it to you. Well, how about the environmental apocalypse? Isn't this an apocalypse? See, this is an apocalyptic worldview. People have adopted the Christian apocalypse, but they've applied it to political affairs, and especially this is true with regard to the environmental movement. So, this is what we have. Look at here in Germany here. They're flooded, global warming. By the way, one of the first men to popularize apocalyptic global warming was Gunther Schwab. He was an Austrian Nazi. He wrote a book called Dance the Devil in 1958. It sold over 1 million copies by 1970. It was not some unknown book. Of course, it was in Germany. This has been around a while. Well, what about the Great Tribulation? There's going to be a lot of problems during the Great Tribulation. Most of them are environmental. The great catastrophes we see. What's all the technical stuff? What's going to happen to all the technical stuff when everything starts to fall apart? My guess is that we're going to be put back to the Stone Age probably pretty quickly. All this discussion about horses and bows and arrows and knives and swords may not be as fantastic as you and I think. Once you take away the infrastructure, what's going to happen to technology? I mean, just look at what happened to Japan. That was just, that's something minor compared to what's coming. There's a passage in Revelation chapter 6 where it says that the wild beasts of the earth are going to devour a certain percentage, a high percentage of mankind. I think there's several things mentioned, but one of them is the wild beasts. The predators are going to start eating people up. That means people really can't defend themselves anymore. Nature is somehow going to come back, and environmentalists are going to save enough of animals so they can be eaten by them in the future. By the way, the Lord has he's going to have the birds coming back too. Revelation 19. Birds can kind of fly around. Apparently, they're not so. All the environmental disasters, they can somehow survive. I guess I don't know, but there's going to be a lot of birds. The big feast in Revelation 19. A lot of eagles, vultures. And today you just see 3 of them, flying when somebody dies out in the desert in old westerns, but it's going to be a big feast. Wow. Well, Satan, what does he do? He often uses nature and or nature worship to seduce mankind. It started in the garden, and it continues ever since. And, of course, it goes to the Tower of Babel, because the Tower of Babel really institutes and organizes what we would call the nature worship system. Notice, again, the beautiful tree. You get all this tree worship. Of course, we got a tree down there. Got some pretty stuff up here, too. Anyway, we see what's going on here. He's using nature to fool people. Is there anything wrong with nature? No. But it's something people are attracted to. God made it. It's beautiful. It's artistic. And so what happens? People start worshiping the nature rather than the God who made it, because they can't see the God who made it. Of course, that's called unbelief. But a lot of his plans work through nature. Star worship, sun worship, that was all in Egypt. And, of course, by the time we get later New Testament times with Old Testament times, Baalism, that was what Satan used to fool people. The tree of knowledge of good and evil. Wasn't that a tree? Yes, it was. And what did Satan promise? He promised them enlightenment by evolutionary pantheism. You will become like God. So really, this idea of evolution goes back to Genesis chapter 3. That was Satan's ploy. And then after partake the forbidden fruit, what do we have? The natural man in opposition to God. Of course, Paul calls him the flesh, made up of biology and instinct, and that's about it. Appetites, without any reference to God. And by the way, if you've got a tree growing in your head, you're probably not doing very good. You're not going to be able to think through your problems. By the way, this is what existentialism is all about, a picture of existentialism right there, because they deny human rational thought as being important. What's more important is the will. This is why Nietzsche emphasized the will to power, because he denied that, we live in an people are irrational, so he said it can't be important, therefore willpower is more important than thinking. So nature trumps thought. Wonderful. And really, this goes back to the Babylonian nature religion. Babel revered the polytheistic gods of nature. Ancient Babylon is a religious source for evolutionary pantheism. Ancient Babel prided itself in its religious building technology. and I'm a little bit sarcastic, Tower of Babel was the first green building. But isn't that nature worship? Aren't they nature worshipers? Yes. And by the way, don't get this idea that environmentalism is totally contrary to economies or with regard to technology. It's not true. Nazi Germany blended them perfectly together, at least in their minds. The aristocracy, by the way, a lot of rich people are behind the environmental movement. They provide lots of money. Without the aristocracy and rich people or rich corporations providing them money, the environmental movement would be dead. Germany today is the greenest country on the planet. They're also one of the richest. So keep in your mind that some of these myths that we have are not necessarily true with regard to the green movement. And nature worship, by the way, and the worship of man are not contradictory. They do go together, as we've already mentioned. Of course, in the Bible, historical Nimrod, he was a grandson of Ham, whose line was cursed. Genesis 9. Nimrod was a mighty king and hunter, the founder of pagan imperialism. That all goes back to Babel. Nimrod was the founder of Nineveh in Assyria, and Nimrod was the founder of Babylon, the land of Shinar. So he becomes foundational to a lot of different things, which, by the way, the Lord is going to bring to an apocalyptic end back in Babylon. And I think, what was it, Dave Hunt, that said, where history began is going to be the place where it will end. In one of his books. I think it was one of the books I read. That's a good statement. Nimrod became the god of nature in ancient mythology. It's not mentioned in the Bible, but we do have other sources that tell us this. According to legend, Nimrod instituted sun worship and idolatry. According to legend, Nimrod instituted astrology. Also, tree worship. Of course, Hislop says Christmas tree goes back to Nimrod. So Merry Christmas. In Russia, they just say Happy New Year. They kind of forgot about Christmas. Maybe we should do the same. I don't know. I just don't want to ruin your Christmas. When the Yule log is burned up, the green Christmas tree replaces it, the fountainhead of green renewable energy. Of course, I'm being sarcastic when I say that. Nimrod's wife, mother in legend, mythology, was Semiramis, the queen of heaven and the goddess of the earth. Josephus said she was married to Nimrod. She was a harlot. She was the ancient goddess of love and fertility and vegetation. She was the instigator of ancient nature worship, mythology, and star worship. And, of course, we look at the woman at the end in the book of Revelation, very similar. She was a whore as well. Genesis 11, the dispersion will spread and confuse the Babel mythology. So now it's going to be divvied up into different languages. So we got different names for some of these folks, but basically it's the same operation. So we got either Ephesus, she becomes Diana, for example. You've heard of Diana. In Egypt, Isis, which was mentioned yesterday. Rome, Venus. Greece, Aphrodite. Israel, Ashtaroth. And notice all the things that Baal later becomes. That's Nimrod, basically. Nimrod becomes Baal. So Baal was married to Ashtaroth, and that's sort of the Nimrod, Queen of Heaven marriage. Or we can call it harlotry, is better to call it. Canaanites believed that Baal was a storm and fertility god who bestowed upon man and land the blessings of fertility. He sent forth lightning, fire, and rain. He gave corn, oil, wine. He did everything. He could revive the dead, heal the sick, and bestow the blessing, give health care, whatever you want to call it. This was Baal. The weather, too. What was Elijah fighting? He was fighting global warming, wasn't he? Wasn't there, at least, he actually predicted it. It was getting hot, getting dry. What are we going to do? Well, Baal was the answer to most people, and Elijah says, no, God is. And by the way, Elijah was under a lot of pressures, wasn't he? It was a time of tyranny, environmental tyranny. And Baalism was at the heart of the issue. Now, this is what they should have been doing with regard to what God had plans for Israel in the Promised Land to enjoy the blessings. He gives them a place of rest, a place of retirement for them to enjoy. And this is what should have taken place. But Baalism subverted every one of these spiritual principles which the Lord gave to them. So they no longer even had these things. We could spend a lot of time all day looking at these verses. And these verses protected Israel and their economy and their way of life from distorting or going back to, the pagan nature worship around them, which was so rampant. So what happened? Instead of those things, we have the eco-fascist tyranny of Baalism. The northern kingdom under Ahab and Jezebel was an oppressive time of global warming and eco-tyranny under the nature worship of Baal. Many verses on this. The 60s generation of the northern kingdom, the H60s, was a time of strict environmental asceticism and raving and also perverse sexuality with cult prostitution. Isn't that what the 60s was all about, pretty much? Have things evolved? Not that much, have they? Not really. We're going backwards. So they would cut themselves. Here's our environmental asceticism for what? Fertility of nature. And on one hand, they had this sexual perverseness, which was, wild and unbelievable. See, God is actually very different. God is very free with most things with regard to what we do. But he's very strict on marriage and sex. Today, our culture is exactly the opposite. With regard to sex, you can do anything you want to, but everything else is forbidden. Which one do you want? If you have your own family in order, you love God, you love your wife, and vice versa, you can take care of you can do a lot of other things too. God gives you freedom to do those things. If you can't do that, then why would he give you more? And of course, we're losing our freedom. So that goes back to these very issues. Baalism destroyed both houses of Israel and Judah. Hosea compares Israel's Baalism as a drunken whorehouse of death by his marriage to Gomer. God commanded him to marry a prostitute. And by the way, that command is not for you. And then you read passages, commentators, they sit there and they get all uptight about this. How can this be? Oh, she couldn't have been a real prostitute. Well, it illustrated God's relationship to Israel was so bad. It was rotten. Oak trees were worshipped. Judges 9, Isaiah 44, Ezekiel 6, Hosea chapter 4. Isaiah speaks of Israel's lack of spiritual leadership and the child sacrifice of Baalism in Isaiah 57. 2 Kings showcases Baalism to explain why Israel was carried captive to Babylon, a whole chapter on it. Jeremiah compares Baalism with brute instinctive behavior which ruined Judah. And Ezekiel predicts a Babylonian captivity because of Judah's nature worship in Ezekiel chapter 6. So these things preceded Israel's downfall. And so while in Babylon, God will now reveal to Daniel the future. So here on the one hand, we have our human worship. That was Daniel chapter 2 with regard to prediction of the future, right? Well, what about Daniel 7? Now they're compared to wild animals. Here's our nature worship. And what's the Antichrist called? He's called the beast. He's compared to a wild animal. By the way, Hitler liked to call himself Uncle Wolf. That was his favorite term. He imagined himself a wolf howling to the crowds. He called his SS his pack of wolves. Hermann Goering used to walk lions around. He loved, he liked the lions. He loved animals. So did Hitler. A lot of these Nazis, they loved animals, especially the predator type. Never Cry Wolf cult, where was that born? Nazi Germany. Aldo Leopold visited Nazi Germany in 1935. He's the father of deep ecology in America. He thought it was great, many of the things the Nazis were doing with regard to the environmental movement in 1935. He didn't congratulate everything he did, but he says, wow, they're actually doing something. Americans just talk about it. He's revered today. Of course, he was also a hunter, by the way. And Nimrod was a hunter. Teddy Roosevelt was a hunter. He was a conservationist. Aldo Leopold, the father of deep ecology, he loved hunting. Native Americans, they love hunting too. Don't they? There's something spiritual about hunting. And here we have God's plan. These are hunting God's people. That's the problem with these creatures. You need to have a hunter to put them down. Well, the Lord will finally do it for us. So facing a wild Gentile beast in the wilderness of prophecy, the Babylonian Empire is compared to a lion, the Persian Empire is compared to a bear, the Greek Empire is compared to a leopard, and of course the divided Greco-Roman Empire is called the beast. Of course some passages he looks like a dragon or a dinosaur, whatever we want to call this creature, a reptile. The snake evolves from a snake to a dragon apparently. And this nature worship will continue. Of course, Israel will walk away from this, which is good after the Babylonian captivity, but it will continue in other places of the world and become very important, especially in places like Greece. The oaks of Zeus, by the way, Baal becomes Zeus in Greece, or not Baal, but Nimrod. And Celtic nature worship, also very important. Oak tree, very sacred to Zeus. So Baal was Zeus in Greece, the god of thunder and the god of the oaks. Again, oak tree sitting right there. What would they do? Well, sacrifices were performed there. Pagan nature worship symbolized by the mighty oak trees. Both Greeks and Romans associated the oak tree with Zeus and Jupiter. Priests prayed for rain at the Dodona oak in Athens near the Parthenon. Zeus' wife Hera was the oak goddess. Druids were Celtic pagans, which means men of the oaks. That's what Druids apparently means, at least according to one writer. Oak trees were worshipped throughout Europe. Animal and human sacrifices were often practiced under oak trees. In tribal Germany, the oak tree was associated with the Norse god Thor. The god of the oak was the chief god of the Aryans or the Europeans, and the oak tree was considered the holy tree of Germany. And this would become very important for Nazi symbolism during the Third Reich. Now, interestingly enough, St. Boniface, he cut down Thor's oak in the 8th century. And this was a big deal. And, of course, this is how a lot of Europe was Christianized. They would cut down the oak trees or cut down the sacred groves, and replace them with churches. But yet the pagan ideas often remained. And, God commanded Israel to do this in the Old Testament, too, get rid of the Asherah, cut these poles down and get rid of them. Well, so they did that for evangelism. Well, the Fuhrer, he loved oak trees, too. He gave an oak tree sapling to every gold medal winner of the 1936 Olympics. Jesse Owens went home with 4 of them. As far as I know, 2 of them are still alive. Glenn Morris in Colorado got one, too. He had thousands of oaks planted all over the Reich and wartime Poland. Oak leaves and acorns were the primary symbols of the SS. Nazi death camps were often laden with oak tree symbolism, and Adolf Eichmann's last name essentially means the man of the oaks. He was placed in charge of the final solution. He had all the numbers. And he was a fanatic about finding, getting his numbers quota, making sure he got everybody. He didn't quite make it. He came close. Here's an oak tree in Buchenwald. This is a very important oak tree because it's basically Goethe's oak. And who is Goethe? Well, he was the father of German Romanticism. And today, again, we know Romanticism as environmentalism. So he was the father of German Romanticism, the environmental sciences. Romantics wanted to redefine man's relationship with nature against the dualistic, mechanistic, Newtonian science of the Judeo-Christian tradition. It basically means they wanted to get rid of the idea that you were above nature, which is what Genesis 1-3 tells us. God made you in his image, therefore you're above nature. They wanted to get rid of that distinction. Romanticism became fascinated with biology because it exemplified holism and organic interdependence. Goethe said, separateness is the illusion, one and the many are the same. And by the way, fascism is basically holistic learning. That's what they pride themselves in. And some of you may know Montessori, by the way. She was in Mussolini's education. She was Mussolini's education minister for years. And Montessori schools are basically fascist schools, teaching holism as a way of learning. That's what they were all about. Here we have Goethe's oak. Goethe used to sit underneath this tree. It wasn't Buchenwald then. It was out in the forest. And he would enjoy and meditate about nature, his favorite picnic ground. So the Nazis made Buchenwald, they saved the tree. Another important German thinker, Alexander von Humboldt. He deepens Goethe's scientific romanticism. His holism quietly excluded theism. Environment was now king. He synthesized natural history with geography and climate and local ecological conditions, basically the ecosystems. He laid the groundwork for the belief in the German Volk by fusing holism with nationalism. Volk means people or actually race. So he lays the groundwork for this. He laid the groundwork for geopolitics and Lebensraum doctrine in Hitler's Mein Kampf via Haeckel, Ratzel, Karl Hasshofer, and Rudolf Hess. Basically what he did, he emphasized environment, and these other men emphasized Lebensraum, which means living space. And basically, what were the Germans doing in the East? Well, they needed living space. They were running out of room. In Germany, there are too many people. We need to have more space. And a lot of Hitler's ideas were based on these men going back to Alexander von Humboldt. Shockingly enough. Romanticism itself revolted against Christianity. Romantics opposed that God made man in his image because even though man is a created being, he is still above nature. They rejected this thinking. Genesis 1, Psalm 8. The Genesis mandate to subdue and fill the earth is an abomination to Romanticism because they think it leads to utilitarian views of nature and ecological disaster. If you're above nature, you can use nature any way you want to. That's how they always characterize Christianity or Jews ruining nature because they have this idea about man. The shepherd motif in particular, where wolves are killed to protect the sheep, is another abomination to environmentalists. Romantics blame the Dust Bowl on the Puritan farming mentality combined with modern mechanized farming. Forests and mountains are more holy than churches, which are often artificial. This was some of their ideas. And, of course, this man was the most important one in America, Thoreau, really the first American hippie. He was out in the woods in a cabin, Walden Pond. Nature is more important. Nature, his plants and animals become his neighbors. That reduces, it elevates nature and reduces man. He used environmental purity as a basis upon which to judge human society, which is what's happening already. It's environmental ethics. Here's Hitler's favorite philosopher. His name was Arthur Schopenhauer. So at the same time that Thoreau was blaming Christians for ruining the environment in America, at the same time in Germany, men like Schopenhauer were blaming the Jews for the same thing. And by the way, Schopenhauer was in the halls of academia in Germany. Thoreau was by himself out in the woods. These men had much more influence on what's going on. It took Thoreau a couple hundred years to have some kind of influence in America. These men were in charge. Notice his attitude. We owe the animals not mercy but justice, and the debt often remains unpaid in Europe. The continent is permeated with Jews. It is obviously high time that in Europe that Jewish views on nature should be expelled from Europe. This is Hitler's favorite philosopher. By the way, in 1933, the Nazis passed an animal rights law. Basically, Schopenhauer was an animal rights guru, the first one, really, to emphasize these things. Another early German environmentalist, Riel, also very extremely anti-Semitic. He became the German romantic champion of the forests and wetlands. He said the forester was the antithesis to the Jew, who was rootless and had no authenticity. He was just amorphous international something or other, which he had no interest in. He emphasized the rights of wilderness. He was politically active as an early romantic environmentalist. He was a father of environmental sustainability. He strongly emphasized the hardy and healthy character of the German Volk, which means the German race, the folk peasants of the countryside. They were the strongest people. And Riel will mix romanticism and socialism and environmentalism and anti-Semitism all into one. He wrote 3 books called The Natural History of Germany. And notice how he characterizes the Jew. They're rootless. They're not rooted in the soil. They're in the city. Now, what happened to the Jews? Well, they stuffed them in ghettos. Their crime matches, their punishment matches the crime. Of course, later on, they went to the gas chambers. A lot of these things sort of build it up. They just took a while. But these ideas, they continue to fester. Here's another one. Ernst Haeckel, the father of German ecology and social Darwinism. This man coined the term ecology in 1866. Yet he's also the father of German social Darwinism. He was an extreme Darwinist who developed German social Darwinism. He was the first German scientist to describe the Jews as a biological problem. Wonderful. He mutated Darwinian natural selection into racial eugenics. Wow. German evolution and ecology were holistically fused together. He began a scientific pantheistic philosophy known as monism. Today we call it social Darwinism. And of course, monism emphasizes oneness, again, holism. He used it, he emphasized holism from a scientific point of view. Nietzsche is something very important. You need to pay attention to him. Notice the words Antichrist here. Nietzsche stressed Schopenhauer's will over mind, which really is at the heart of existentialism. Will is more important. Nietzsche wanted to replace the weakness and otherworldly nature of Judeo-Christian morality with a biological ethic based on instinct and willpower rooted in the earth. That's what Nietzsche wanted. Nietzsche claimed God was dead, or as good as dead, so Western man must learn to live courageously and face the future with new based earth values, Superman values. We need to become Supermen of the earth. By the way, the Nazis thought that they were those men. Nietzsche was revered by him, by them. Nietzsche believed in evolution, but suggested will was more important than natural selection. That's an interesting distinction. Next to Schopenhauer, Nietzsche was Hitler's second favorite philosopher. The Nietzsche archives became a shrine for National Socialism. And of course, we have all those earth dwellers mentioned in the book of Revelation, those who dwell on the earth. And of course, they call for the mountains to come on down, come on top of us. They love the mountains. So now it brings us up to the Nazi period. The Nazis came up with a doctrine called blood and soil, which basically means Nazi racism and Nazi environmentalism brought together. And Himmler's teacher, Walter Darre, was the man who emphasized this doctrine. It became very popular. And the early German Green Movement got caught up into this, what we call Nazi blood and soil. In 1934, Nazi biologist Walter Schoenitsch said, National Socialism and environmental protection stand in a tight connection because the Fuhrer wills a new German Volksgemeinschaft whose foundation is drawn from the blood and soil, from the primordial forces of life and soul that are proper to our race, and from the nature-willed bond that subsists between us and the sod of the homeland. Now, that's a loaded statement. But here we have Nazi environmentalism and racism brought together. Notice that Hans Schwenkel, very interesting, stated that since the first book of Moses, the Jews do not know nature protection, since God has given to the children of Israel all plants and animals for their enjoyment. It's like they can abuse it and not, they don't have any nature protection laws. We're better than them. In 1933, the Nazis passed an animal rights law. That made Passover very difficult to implement, by the way, because with the Jewish, you have the kosher ritual slaughter. 1934, of course, that would go for any kind of meat. 1934, Goering passed a green Nazi hunting law. That began with Hermann Goering. He loved to hunt. 1934, the Nazis also implemented strict direwald forestry practices. Then in 1935, the Nazis passed the Reich Nature Protection Act. These were all big environmental laws for their time. By the way, even the 4-year plan was to be regulated by environmental spatial planning. And the Nazis were going to turn the eastern Russian steppe into a green, sustainable economy that would later be extended throughout the Reich after the war. Basically, they wanted to turn the eastern front into a park for Germans to enjoy. That's what the war was all about. Take away living space from, get rid of the Jews, take it away from the Slavs, and get rid of them too, and then to have all kinds of living space for Germans. Well, Mr. Heidegger, he's important too. He emphasized existential environmentalism. He was an early German conservationist. He believed in blood and soil existentialism, which is a little bit different than blood and soil biology. He believed that the fatherland, for example, itself was being, whatever that means. That's part of his existentialism. He interpreted Nietzsche for National Socialist existential consumption. He wanted to return to Greek philosophy before the corruption of Plato that emphasizes thought over being. See, again, they attacked the mind. He was involved in Nazi book-burning ceremonies and the removal of Jewish professors. After the war, he became an environmentalist whose views often coincided with what we call today deep ecology. Mr. Heidegger, notice that mustache. He shaved it off later. Nazi death and concentration camps and environmentalism. Well, this is shocking. For example, at Treblinka, they had a fox recovery program to bring back the foxes in Poland, right next door. So on one hand, the SS side of the camp was a beautiful camp. A garden looked like a garden, and they had a little zoo there for the SS to enjoy, and they had a fox recovery program there. And then, of course, next door, they were getting rid of Jews on a massive scale. Almost 1 million died. And then right before they shoved them into the gas chambers, they would walk through what they call the way to heaven. And, of course, they're going into the gas chambers as they go in. By the way, that's German existentialism. People have actually blamed Christianity for this. It's not true. That's Nietzsche existentialism at work. Here's at Auschwitz. They had a wonderful little retreat center. A lot of people had a good time. Rudolf Höss, in charge of Auschwitz, he was a nature lover. Again, shocking. This is at Buchenwald. They had little bears there to enjoy. Here we got somebody feeding the deer at Buchenwald as well. Animal lovers, people haters. Wow. Adolf Hitler was a forerunner of the Antichrist in very interesting ways. His Nazi Party membership number was 555, but later changed it to number 7. He knew the messianic nature of that number. He was an ascetic vegetarian who was planning to make Germany vegan after the war. That's interesting. By the way, I think 1 Timothy 4:3 tells us that in the last times men will forbid marriage, whatever that means. I think it's going to be more than just monasticism and monkery in the church. Men will forbid marriage and also the eating of meat. And Hitler waxes eloquently about this all the time in Hitler's Table Talk. He wanted to make Germany vegan. He even believed his own dog would become vegan. Wow. His 1933 animal welfare law essentially forbid Jewish ritual slaughter and Passover. Think about this with regard to the Jewish sacrifices if they build the temple and start reinstituting the animal sacrifices. What will the world say? Especially now that we've become so strong with our environmental thinking. He had plans to take control of the economy after the war. Of course, we know this to be especially the case, Revelation chapter 13. He asserted that he will become a religious figure and boasted that some people already worship him. Of course, we know that 2 Thessalonians 2:4, the Antichrist will demand that people worship him. Notice again, he defined fascism as spontaneous return to the traditions of Rome. And, of course, Daniel predicts the coming back of the Roman Empire. He had plans to change the Judeo-Christian calendar. Remember the passage in Daniel 7:25 where they will make changes in times and in law. They're going to change those things. See, man wants to burst the fetters of God. Psalm 2. He believed in a green, blood and soil, 1,000-year millennial Reich for Germany in contrast to Israel and the Promised Land. Some important quotes from the Fuhrer. Notice that 1937, never was humanity in its external appearance and its frame of mind nearer to the ancient world than it is today. Wow. Let's bring back the Roman Empire, which is what he wanted to do. Notice the next quote. The great migration set out from the east. With us begins the ebb from west to east. That's in accordance with the laws of nature. By means of the struggle, the elites are continually renewed. The law of selection justifies this incessant struggle by allowing the survival of the fittest. Christianity is a rebellion against natural law, a protest against nature. Taken to its logical extreme, Christianity would mean the systematic cultivation of human failure. And, of course, God picks those human failure, the people that are failed, the runts. That's who God picks. Hitler got rid of those runts. Again, totally different than what God wanted. But notice, now we're going to go east. Okay, what's the Antichrist going to do? He's heading east. Isn't that what he's doing? Starts out. I assume the Antichrist is still coming from Rome. I haven't seen anything to suggest otherwise. I know people debate it. But the princes to come, I think that's pretty clear in my opinion. He's starting out in Rome and he's heading east. By the way, today, Italy's a little country. It's a little horn. Of course, I think it's probably going to be smaller than that, or whatever it's emphasizing in Daniel. It's not a big country today. The Nazis thought they were big scientists. They thought they were the best science in the world, but wow. What do we got going on today? Well, a lot of things. Modern science was originally built on natural theology that presumed God made a rational world governed by rational natural laws. That's the science of the Middle Ages. Newton, physics was based on those ideas. The Enlightenment replaced the natural theology of Bacon and Newton with naturalism. The Romantics then plunged science into holism and existentialism. See, there's a lot of ideas that have gotten into the scientific worldview, which have distorted the whole point of science. Darwin plunged the scientists into the tyranny of nature through evolution. Haeckel then infused evolution with pantheism, monism, eugenics, and politics. Wonderful. Quantum mechanics infused romantic vitalism into physics. Nazi Aryan science replaced the Baconian slogan, knowledge is power, with Nietzsche's will to power. That's a big difference. When you replace knowledge with will, what's that going to do to the scientific department with regard to knowledge? That's a big change. It's a huge one. Now, in practice, they couldn't implement that, but that's another story. They wanted to. Hitler characterized science as a communion with nature. Conservationist Paul Sears stated in 1964 that ecology had become the favored child of the sciences. And now we have what they call post-normal environmental science. This is a holistic, politicized science that deconstructs the traditional view of science. See, they say, look, science is too reductionistic. It can't help us solve political problems. So now they've extended out. Let's emphasize post-normal science here. They don't know the answers, and yet they believe the stakes are very high. Therefore, we need to come up with some answers to this, scientific solutions. And, of course, science is stretched out to the point where it becomes no longer science. And yet they call it science to you. And they get away with it. After World War II, environmentalism became a global movement. Aldo Leopold's deep ecology replaced the Roosevelt Pinchot conservationism, which you and I probably believe. That's usually what we think about environmentalism. Well, that's not what environmentalism is. Austrian Nazi Gunther Schwab's Dance with the Devil prefaced the entire environmental litany in the modern age in 1958. The peak oil theory was heavily promoted throughout the 1960s and 70s, and then Rachel Carson wrote this book, Silent Spring, which ignited North American environmentalism. The Environmental Think Tank Club of Rome was established in 1968. Remember, Hitler wanted to return Europe back to Rome. Well, interestingly, and of course, he was something of an environmentalist. Well, the Club of Rome is an environmental think tank. And they're behind a lot of the things we see going on today in our world with regard to environmental regulation. They read one of the most popular books read of all time in environmental communities. It's called The Limits to Growth. And that's their book. 1972. Sustainable development has seemingly replaced communism and the older socialism of Europe. Global warming then became the chief concern of the environmental movement starting in the 1990s. The Club of Rome, established in 1968, is the most powerful think tank, environmentally speaking, in the world. It is comprised of major political leaders, UN bureaucrats, and green leaders, and economists and scientists from all over the globe. It is extremely well funded by many major financiers and important financial groups. A lot of these big corporations and banks, they don't give money to people like you and me. They're religious. What do? They give their money to environmental causes, especially today. It strongly pushes for holistic long-term solutions to the world's problems. Of course, God is kept out of it. It's holistic. God can't be a part of it. It sees limits to growth as man's modern predicament, which it calls a world problematique. There's too many people and not enough space. Where have we heard this before? And what are we going to do to solve this problem? They have answers. By the way, Ted Turner, in charge of CNN, he's a rich guy. He thinks 300 million people is be about enough for the earth. 300 million. And, okay, well, what are you going to do with all them people? No, God doesn't worry. He commanded it, fill and replenish the earth. But people are worried about these things. There's too many people. Interesting enough, in the 1970s, the Club of Rome wanted to divide the planet into 10 bioregions. Of course, we know the 10 kingdoms are discussed in the book of Daniel. I don't think there's a connection, but it's interesting to me how they're thinking here. I take it the 10 kingdoms are, the European Union in some way, or 10 leading nations. Very well, I don't know how it's going to work out. I'll let the Lord worry about it. Bioregionalism is global environmental Lebensraum. This is a big push today. Bioregionalism is where environmentalists define as an area that shares similar human culture, topography, plant, and animal life. Bioregions are often organized around watersheds and can be nested within each other. Bioregional boundaries are usually not rigid and often differ from political borders around countries, states, and provinces. They want to redraw the maps and use bioregionism to do it. Ideally, bioregions are places that should be self-sufficient in terms of food, products, and services and would therefore have a sustainable impact on the environment. So you're creating all these self-sufficient economies. That's what Nazi Germany was trying to do in the 1930s. Then Hitler couldn't do it. Then, of course, he tried. Then he had to conquer all these nations. He still wasn't self-sufficient because that's not the plan of God. It's not reality. But that's what they wanted. Environmentalism does too. This is a new thing, Agenda 21. Well, it's been around since early 1990s, but emphasizes sustainable development. Basically, Agenda 21 bypasses Congress, goes straight from the UN to your local community, and passes all kinds of regulations through the local people there, so you can not build a house or whatever it is you want to do. You're going to have problems doing it. I think Tim mentioned some issues. Government permission program. Spatial planning, basically, which is rooted in the Nazi era. Agenda 21, the Rio Declaration on the Environment and Development, and the Statement of Principles for the Sustainable Management of Forests were adopted by more than 178 governments. Agenda 21 is designed to force the entire world to adopt sustainable development program for the UN itself, down to the local region of where people live. And they want to rewild a lot of areas of America, just keep people out of it. Then we have the Earth Charter. Notice the Declaration of Interdependence. Again, that holism, very important to them. Earth Champs, by the way, they even emphasize an environmental or Sabbath Day. You and I know Earth Day, that's for political reasons. They have also Environmental Sabbath Day for religious reasons. And they also talk about a new covenant with the earth. So again, the religious language is there. They're borrowing from Christianity, and then they make fun of us all at the same time. I mean, this is ridiculous. Of course, remember, Satan wants to be like God. So he counterfeits everything. And here we have a big counterfeit of everything. The Gaia hypothesis. Well, there's our woman, maybe. By the way, we had a good lecture yesterday on the Catholic Church. Ratzinger is SS. Did you know that? He was in the SS as a young man. He's also green. These things can come together in some strange way. It's not impossible. James Lovelock postulated the earth itself, Gaia, as an ancient evolutionary and complex living organism. All life forms on the earth, pantheistically, belong to Gaia. Biodiversity co-evolves with other organisms to benefit the larger whole of Gaia, and Gaia is named after the Greek goddess who drew life out of chaos. Gaia was considered the mother of all life, including the mother of all gods and titans, and Gaia is a total planetary being. By the way, James Lovelock is a scientist. He's had a recent repentance, however. Last year he had a big utility bill in England, and he's not so sure about renewable energy anymore. It got very expensive. And, of course, Israel ruined their economy paying for Baal. We're doing the same. Will environmentalism help bring back the kings of Europe? That's a good question. Many of the kings of Europe, like Nimrod, they were in control of the hunting grounds around the city. And you could not touch them. Martin Luther complained, look, we need to cut wood to keep our houses warm. King said, no, you keep your hands off. That was part of the peasants' revolt, by the way. And then, of course, Martin Luther said, you guys got out of control. Charles, boy, he's a lover of nature. Prince Philip, he wishes he can come back being reincarnated as some kind of disease to kill off a bunch of people. That's his dad. Princess Diana didn't like the picnics with the royal family very well. I think she found out they were a bunch of environmental fascists. I could be wrong. I'm just guessing. At least some of them. At least her husband. I think the Queen's probably still pretty decent. By the way, he's called the earth as a mosque. We can talk about environmentalism, Islam, too. Malcolm X was a vegetarian, by the way. The Twin Towers, that came down, they wanted to replace that with a green mosque nearby. That mosque that they were going to put in near Ground Zero, that was going to be a green one. Do you know that? Yeah. And a lot of Islam emphasizes nature. So these things can come together in a very strange way that we need to be paying attention to. And environmentalism may also help bring back these kings of Europe. How is modern environmentalism related to the Whore of Babylon? That's a good question. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. but I think it will certainly play some role in the future, and we need to pay our attention, keep our watch on the environmental movement. They have an Ark of Hope, a wooden chest. They did this on a pilgrimage, by the way. They went to different cities across the country, different parts of the world. They call it the Ark of Hope. Provides a refuge for what they call the Temenos books, so it's like the Ten Commandments, which are a collection of images and words for global healing, peace, and gratitude. Recognizing the UN as central to global efforts to solve problems which challenge humanity, the Ark of Hope was exhibited at the UN during the World Summit in January, February 2002. And, of course, they even went around with different schools and universities and museums carrying this ark around. So these are things to be thinking about as we look at the environmental movement. It is not necessarily this tree hugger, touchy-feely type thing. There are some dangers with regard to the environmental movement. Of course, we don't quite see those things yet, but they may come. And something similar to Nazi Germany may, again, blow up at some point in the future. I'm not saying it will, but I think something like this may. This gives a picture, a warning. And, of course, we know the Great Tribulation will be a terrible time. So with that in mind, I'm done with the lecture. Thank you very much.